More than 2,000 federal government contracts a year are awarded to religious organizations and contractors that provide essential services in many vital programs. President Obama, in Executive Order 13559, affirmed the right of religious service providers and contractors to equal opportunity to compete with secular organizations for funding while still retaining their religious identity. The President's order made clear that, quote, decisions must be free from political interference or even the appearance of such interference and must be made on the basis of merit, not on the basis of religious affiliation or lack thereof of the recipient organization, end quote. The President's order also emphasized that, quote, faith-based providers are eligible to compete for assistance under federal government social service programs and to participate in those programs while maintaining their religious identity as described in the executive order, end quote. Unfortunately, guidance from the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, or the OFCCP, however well-intended, has caused some confusion on the President's executive order regarding religious contractors within the scope of their protections under law. The guidance also violates the compelling interest standard with regard to the free exercise clause of the First Amendment as set forth in multiple Supreme Court rulings that, quote, unduly burdens the practice of religion, end quote. Just 3 weeks ago, on March 31st, President Obama felt compelled to reaffirm the rights and eligibility of religious service providers and contractors and how they contribute to our nation. I applaud the President's affirmation and concern of misinterpretations as they apply to 9 departments and agencies. This amendment simply eliminates the ambiguity within DoD by tying the existing protections that have been well established for decades under the provisions of 702A and 703E2 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. These provisions of law are sound, support the President's assertions, and eliminate the ambiguity, however well-intended, that the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs has caused. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I oppose this amendment because the problem is the exemption is meant for religious organizations. If you are a religious organization that has a certain set of beliefs, that is in keeping with and consistent with the Hobby Lobby decision. The way this amendment is written, it doesn't matter if you're a religious organization. Basically, you be a private contractor, and this basically gives you the right to discriminate if you just decide that you don't want to do business with gay people or with anybody else, for that matter, on a discriminatory basis within a protected class. So, you know, we have the executive order to say that the federal government isn't going to do business with contractors who discriminate based on that, and we have the religious exemption for certain religious organizations to remain consistent with the court decision. But the way this is written, this would basically, give a blanket right to discriminate to any subcontractor within the Department of Defense and would prohibit us and the federal government from saying, look, if you're going to do that, we don't want to do business with you. So I oppose this amendment and yield back.
Further discussion?
Chairman.
Mr. Peters?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also oppose Mr. Russell's amendment, which would allow federal contractors to discriminate against people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender on the faulty basis of religious exemption by making that apply to federal contractors. The intent of carving out an exemption for religious corporations, organizations, and other groups is misguided, and the ambiguity of this exemption is dangerous with this broad definition of religious organization. Last year, I proposed an amendment on the House floor to affirm that appropriations for transportation, housing, and urban development would not be in conflict with the President's executive order. My amendment passed with support from 60 Republicans, including 9 Republican members who sit on this committee today. Last year and this year, every American deserves to be treated equally and with dignity, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. I urge my colleagues, all of them, to vote against this dangerous amendment, and in so doing, stand on the side of equality and against discrimination. I yield back.
Mr. Scott.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank Mr. Russell for bringing this amendment. We have a First Amendment in this country, and that First Amendment applies to everybody. And I think this is a good amendment, and I look forward to supporting it. I yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Russell if he would like to speak further on it.
And I thank the gentleman from Georgia. Actually, this is not what is being characterized, and I ask my distinguished colleagues on the other side of the aisle. We have cooperated on many different measures. This is not what you've been informed of. This new rule is applicable as the President laid out in establishing and affirming Executive Order 13559. He had to establish new guidelines that applied to USDA, Department of Ed, Health and Human Services, DHS, HUD, Department of Justice, Labor, VA, and USAID. Unfortunately, Department of Defense has not those provisions. That's what this amendment does. It does the same thing that codifies Executive Order 13559 that would offer the same protections on the level playing field on all sides of the issue. Now, I know it may have the information that you've been provided by those that would try to make this something other than what it is. This rule affirms prior policy that faith-based organizations are no less eligible than secular organizations to deliver federally funded services. What might those be? For the Department of Defense, it can run the entire gamut from regular contracts to substance abuse programs, to family counseling programs, to mental health programs, organizations that have provided key and essential services to our military for decades, now under the ambiguity, have been forced to shut down operations. This corrects that, consistent with the President's own statements that he made through the White House on March 31st, and it also reaffirms Executive Order 13559. So I am sensitive to the objections by the members on the other side of the aisle. However, that is not the fight that you're looking for. This is reaffirming what the President is already doing in making a level playing field. We do have a First Amendment. It says the free exercise thereof, and that's been upheld in multiple Supreme Court decisions. And I yield back to my colleague from Georgia.
Time of the gentleman has expired.